Where are you leaning on the political election and why?
Is there's a difference between a close election and a volatile election. This election is not going to be close. If no black swan occurs, Donald Trump will be the 47th president of the United States. There is good and evil, and he's on the right side. The other choice is on the wrong side of every foreign policy question for the last 50 years.
Where are you leaning on the political election and why?
Well, obviously, I've supported Trump for president, which is going to be the first time. I did not vote for him in 2016 or 20, but I think there's just no choice.
What changed for you then?
Well, I think 10/7, Hamas basically proving that there's a lot of evil in the world and someone needs to confront it. I think it was unnecessary. I think if the administration in D.C. were different, that never would have happened. All my friends in Israel would be alive today. We would have not witnessed, sort of the worst atrocities since the Holocaust. And I think we need to change. So I think that's number one. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I think the intellectual bankruptcy of the left has become more stark. You can watch some old videos like the State of the Union or the DNC speech of Bill Clinton in 1992. And you would think it's like Donald Trump speaking, maybe even to the right of Donald Trump. So I think the left has just gone stir crazy. Mm-hmm. And so there isn't a choice from that side either.
Feels like the left went so far left that now if you were right, you're kind of in the middle there. It's just...
Well, I mean, like Kamala Harris is the constellation of all the worst people in the world she's importing and the worst ideas. Like she's literally supported all the worst ideas over the last century. Yeah. And so I just think it's like this is the easiest decision ever to support Trump, even though I was critical of him in 2016 and 20.
I think that's important to be able to change your mind too in terms of new light, because I think a lot of people didn't support Trump at first. Now
I didn't support him in the primary. I obviously had a different candidate that I preferred, but I think there is good and evil, and he's on the right side.
If you could predict the future here for us, what do you think happens in the next 4 years if Kamala is elected?
Well, I don't think it'll happen, so I'm not too worried about it. I think there's a difference between one distinction that I'll draw that hopefully transcends, history, because it's going to get taped and broadcast forever, is there's a difference between a close election and a volatile election. This election is not going to be close, but it is volatile. Like there are black swans in the world.
Yes,
the most important lesson over the last 5 years of my life is how volatile the world can be, like COVID. None of us had ever lived through anything like that, expected anything like that. There are things in the world that happen that just fundamentally shift everything, called black swan events for a reason. So I think the election still 3 weeks out is subject to black swan events that are independent, macro events, independent of any campaign. Mm-hmm. If no black swan occurs, Donald Trump will be the 47th president of the United States in a fairly significant landslide, at least from an electoral vote perspective.
Yeah, and I think there might be like a gray swan, which is social media companies, right? Like we saw in 2020, censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop story, which definitely swayed millions of votes. Mark Zuckerberg publicly admitted that they were censoring information. Facebook obviously controls the biggest demographic of people in the world. Do you think that the social platforms are going to play a big role and potentially skew this time?
Well, fortunately, X is a fairly open platform, and so it'd be much more difficult. There's just more transparency about attempting to censor information. I do think that is true. I saw J.D. Vance on TV yesterday talking about this, but the censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop, which proved that the CCP was funneling money to the Biden family, was both an accurate story by the New York Post and was completely censored on X. The Post account, the New York Post account, was disabled. Yeah. That is inconceivable to me that they shut down one of the most historically, important publications in the history of the United States for a true story. That's like insane. And that did have impact, somehow or another, Trump lost by somewhere between 44,000 and 77,000 votes, depending on how you count. Sure. I do believe he lost on election day by 44,000 to 77,000 votes. But if the world knew that the CCP definitively was sending money to the Biden administration, I think it's easy to make up 50,000 votes just on that. Second thing, as my friend Delian tweeted about this morning, I also believe Pfizer withheld the COVID vaccine by 3 days intentionally to avoid Trump being reelected. I think there's lots of evidence of that. Obviously, they knew the vaccine was going to get approved more than 3 days before the election. If on that Sunday before the election, Pfizer announced we have a vaccine for COVID, Trump easily wins re-election.
I'm curious because I fully resonate with your political points here. And I believe this is a very easy, clear decision for the history of America. But there's a lot of really intelligent people in Silicon Valley that believe the diametric opposite of you and I. Cuban, Vinod.
Well, he's not very intelligent. Nor is he in Silicon Valley. He also hasn't accomplished
anything. He got a little
bit
lucky, but we'll say like Reid Hoffman, Vinod. They're smart guys.
Colleagues and actual colleagues of mine.
Actual colleagues of yours.
Reid and Vinod are very smart, very talented.
Yeah, so what are they seeing?
Well, so in Vinod's case, I think he just personally sees the flaws of Donald Trump as a human. And putting aside whether he's right or wrong about that, it's a very valid perspective. You can critique humans. I actually think most people are supporting Trump as a protest against elite society censorship, and they see how vapid Kamala is, but it doesn't mean that Trump is like this perfect human being. So I think some of that is what he's tapping into and, why he's tweeting. I think Reed just has an incorrect worldview. He's had it forever. He's been like left since college. He just believes in socialism. At the end of the day, some versions of socialism, and it's ideologically. Vinod is not a socialist. He's a capitalist. He's a very successful capitalist. He believes in capitalism and how capitalism can be channeled to improve society is his real goal in life. And I think he's very effective at it. I do think he's reacting to the personal traits. And, it's hard to critique that. I just think there's other issues too. Like, for example, like what are we going to do about Iran? What are we going to do to support Israel? And you can have character flaws as a human, but still be on the right side of that question. Whereas I think the other choice is on the wrong side of every foreign policy question for the last 50 years.
Right. Even let's just say Trump didn't have the most admirable qualities and you didn't support him as a person. If he was going to enact all the policies that were going to put America in the best position to be a great nation, we're gonna advocate for the policy and overlook some of the personal flaws.
It's a reasonable debate. Do you elect a president based upon personal traits or policy?
Yeah.
And it's probably a mix in most voters' minds of both.
Yeah.
But I could easily see why someone would skew 90% 10,
Yeah.
or I can justify skewing the other way 90% 10.
I think it's interesting too I think to get back to really continue to progress and maintain our status as a superpower and leading the world in technology, business, and everything else, we need more entrepreneurs in government, less lobbyists, less politicians. Like Elon wants to come in here and do the government efficiency.
Yeah, that'll be exciting.
That would be
incredible. Very effective. I think we just need talented people.
Yeah.
And I think having had a role in the private sector certainly helps.
Yeah.
So for example, neither Kamala nor Tim Walz have ever had a private sector job in their entire lives. I mean, maybe she worked at McDonald's, maybe she didn't, but that's the most experience she might have had in her entire life of earning a paycheck from real people.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to have that experience and build stuff. And it doesn't mean you have to do just that. You don't have to be a businessman for decades to be successful as a politician. Mm-hmm. But I think some experience where people voluntarily give you their money versus at gunpoint, they tax you and take your money, which is all her experience and all his experience, I think is not effective. Similarly, I do believe that raising a family is important. And Donald Trump's raised a very successful family. I've had the benefit of meeting, a lot of his family, and they're all great people, wonderful people. I'm super excited. I'd be proud to have raised a family as well as he has. Whereas, Kamala has never raised a family. And I think that matters. Delian will put this on steroids.
Delian, I would never invest in her.
Yeah. Well, that I'm sure of. I admit there's 5 presidents in the history of the United States who didn't have children.
Yeah.
But none in the last, as far as I can tell, in the last century or more. And so I think it's an artifact of history. And 3 of the presidents were pretty good, 2 were very bad. So, but I think it is important if you're building a foundation for society and leading the America into the future, having raised children is a pretty important criteria, and having raised them well is an endorsement.
It's interesting too when you see Tim Walz and his own family doesn't want to vote for him.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, you wouldn't vote. Anybody who knows him doesn't really want to vote for him. It's a little bit like Kamala. Like 93% of her staff quit. Imagine you were like working for an executive where 93% of their team.
Those Glassdoor ratings.
No. Yeah, theirs are biased and distorted. I wouldn't do that. But just the stat of 93% of staff, and she's about to have more turnover this week. I'm pretty sure because that campaign is in deep trouble.
At a high level too, what do you think the greatest threat to America right now is? Like, there's looming talks of World War III, Iran gaining more nuclear power, or the tensions in the Middle East. We have Russia, the CCP. Like,
I don't think Russia will turn into an existential threat. Their economy isn't strong enough. Putin's pretty savvy and isn't going to do anything like crazy. Yeah. Like, he's predictable in a certain sense.
I think Iran is the scariest.
Yeah, Iran is both crazy, unpredictable, and ideological in a weird way. And enabling them to get nuclear power would be an unmitigated disaster. I think that is another critique of both Obama and Biden, that this was predictable and was preventable, and now it's going to take significant Israeli intervention to save us. This almost happened. Syria almost got a nuclear weapon in the 1980s, and Israel bombed their nuclear factory, their nuclear sort of facilities in 1982 and 3, I think. And, that was critiqued by the world, but it actually saved the planet. And so I think, one way or the other, we're going to have to destroy Iran's ability to get nuclear access, and the sooner the better. There's different ways to do it. You could bomb, you can sabotage. I mean, there's plenty of techniques. I'll leave that to the Mossad and my friend, Mr. Netanyahu. But like, it's embarrassing that we've got this far.
Yeah. What's your take on the kind of political divide now on Israel? It seems like so many people are so quick to kind of turn their back now. And
well, it's interesting. I saw a rigorous poll from NBC News this morning.
Yeah.
And actually 88% of America supports Israel. Now, if you watch social media or you talk to elected Democratic officials, you get a different perspective. And certainly if you read, CBS or something crazy, or the New York Times, all you do is read anti-Semitic garbage. But like 88% of Americans, notwithstanding that, seem to understand there's a right and wrong in the Middle East. And Israel's, a democracy. It's a very effective democracy. It's a very progressive democracy, actually, by any standard. Good news is that normal Americans have a pretty good acid test, a pretty good barometer for truth.
And you think that under the Trump election, we have a strong relationship with Israel?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I saw, the former ambassador to Israel commenting this morning that, and other people that I trust that have, really understand Trump and understand Israel, that Trump would be the most supportive of Israel president we've had since at least Harry Truman, who recognized Israel, which was controversial, in 1948. So I think that's absolutely the case. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He is a very strong supporter of Israel, and he certainly understands the threat posed by Iran. He understood the threat back in Administration 1. When he was the 45th president, he sanctioned Iran. He basically bankrupted Iran, so they had no money to spend. They had no money to support terrorists. Then, by taking the sanctions off and allowing them to sell oil to the Chinese, 70% of their oil is actually sold to China. They developed a $100 billion surplus, which they used to fund Hezbollah and Hamas, which is basically funding terrorism. It's insane to me that the Biden administration doesn't understand if you give bad people money, they're going to use it for bad purposes. It seems like the most obvious concept in the history of the world. And if you deprive them of money, they can't spend it. And, terrorism takes money. Second thing is actually, I believe that the missiles that were actually launched at Israel recently, a few weeks ago, were actually subject to sanctions under the Trump administration. And so Iran wouldn't have had those missiles. And then Biden, I believe on the first day of office, removed those sanctions. So he's also responsible for the missiles that are landing in Israel now because he was too naive about Iran. Or he had supporters. Actually, I think he's both naive and Kamala is naive, but they also have people working for them that are, I don't know if they're officially spies, but they're certainly very sympathetic to the Iran people, and the Iran administration. And I think they were sabotaging good ideas, maybe, not for the best reasons.
Yeah, wow. That's a great synopsis too. And I think, at the end of the day, personally for me, I like to think through about what is best for America, what's best for our well-being. And I look at the national security as number one, our economy. Are we thriving? Our
economy is critical too. As you know, most Americans are not sitting in a luxury house in Miami, and they're not in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And inflation has really been extremely painful in being able to afford groceries, housing, et cetera. And it was kind of unnecessary. This inflation was not required. When Trump left office, we were at 1.8% inflation, which is pretty good actually by historical standards. And I think by spending money artificially on stupid stuff, when the government prints money and spends money, it causes inflation, period. That's basic, simple principle. I think we need to spend less government money, print less government money. I think there's ways to do that and curtail that and still provide for the national defense and other really important initiatives, and possibly even lower taxes too, lower the marginal tax rate. But you need to be disciplined about it. Inflation penalizes the most poor people in the United States and the most middle class. Inflation doesn't affect me very much. I don't have like a loan on my house that, is 3 times, 4 times more expensive than it used to be, et cetera. And so I think inflation is a tax on normal people. And that's why normal people are voting with their feet. Like you saw also in the same NBC poll I read yesterday, by a large margin, people preferred the economy under Trump than Biden. And when they were asked, is their family better off under Trump, by a significant margin, they said yes versus Biden. It's because they see the impact of inflation. And, inflation may be decelerating, but that just means the degree of difficulty is slowing down.
Yeah.
It's not like prices are coming down. Prices are 20 to 80% higher. Even Obamacare, the premiums are 3x higher than when Trump left office. That means healthcare is basically unaffordable.